Hello, my friends. What we are watching right now is not just a war in Ukraine. It is a full spectrum confrontation in which the West, led by Washington and London, is methodically shredding its own legal, financial, and political foundations in a desperate attempt to avoid admitting that its project in Ukraine has failed. And nowhere is that clearer than in the increasingly frantic push to seize Russian sovereign assets. Let's start with a British case because it exposes the entire game. London has long been one of the key global hubs of finance, a place whose power rests not on tanks or missiles, but on contracts, predictability, and the belief that if you park your money there, the rules will be stable. Now, the British government is toying with the idea of ripping that foundation up in order to squeeze a few more years of life out of Kyiv's bankrupt regime. There are around £8 billion in frozen Russian state assets held in Britain, protected by the doctrine of sovereign immunity. We also know there are about £28 billion in frozen Russian private assets, money belonging to individuals, which the government says it has no immediate plan to touch. The focus is on those £8 billion in state assets. For weeks, London has been signaling that it intends to use those assets, either by seizing them outright or by treating them as collateral for zero-interest loans to Ukraine. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a wider European scheme to misappropriate Russian assets held at Euroclear. The British government has been loudly proclaiming its readiness to lead by example, hoping to pressure EU states, especially Belgium, into going along, and then the City of London quietly put its hand up and said absolutely not. The Financial Times reports that major UK banks have pushed back hard. Senior bankers, speaking under condition of anonymity, have warned that they face significant legal risk if they participate in this scheme. They point out that the government has not offered to indemnify them against retaliation or lawsuits from Moscow. They underline the obvious. There is no guarantee that a future peace deal will include Russian reparations to Ukraine that could be used to repay these loans. One banker said it plainly. We are concerned about the legality. The government is setting a new precedent because they have never seized assets in this type of way. Russia will sue for them. That is not the language of minor concern. When British bankers and British lawyers say they are concerned about the legality, what they mean is, this is not legal. Do not do it. The legal trap is clear. If Ukraine inevitably fails to pay back these loans, and the banks then attempt to repossess the collateral the British government claims is theirs, they will run headfirst into the fact that Russia will insist correctly that the money was never Britain's in the first place. A court, whether in Britain or elsewhere, will sooner or later be asked a simple question. Whose money is this? And if the answer is Russia's, the entire scheme collapses. The collateral evaporates. The banks are exposed. The state is exposed. That is why the banks are demanding guarantees, state guarantees. They are saying, if you want to fund Ukraine, fine. But you, the British government, must stand behind the loan with taxpayer money instead of using assets that are not yours. In other words, if you want to give Ukraine £8 billion it will never repay, then admit openly that you are sending British taxpayer money into a black hole. Now set this against the domestic backdrop. Britain is under severe budgetary and monetary stress. Infrastructure is decaying. Parts of the welfare state are buckling. Courts and the justice system are underfunded. Taxes are rising. And in the middle of all this, the government is effectively considering telling the British people, we are going to guarantee an £8 billion loan to Ukraine that will never be repaid, and we will do it using assets that do not legally belong to us. Ask any ordinary Briton if they want to underwrite that, and the answer will be clear. And yet, politically, there is almost complete silence. The government supports the scheme. The conservative opposition supports it. Labor supports it. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats support it. Nigel Farage, the man who likes to present himself as the great outsider and tribune of the people, is saying nothing of substance on this issue and has just appointed a neoconservative foreign policy advisor. The mainstream media, largely cheerleading. What we are looking at is, quite simply, one of the largest attempted peacetime heists in modern history. Done in the open, in front of everyone, with almost no internal dissent. If it goes ahead and sparks a financial crisis, which is far from impossible, the silence of those who knew better or did not bother to understand the implications will condemn them more loudly than any words could. The British case is only one front. On the European continent, we see the same madness. The European Central Bank, Euroclear itself, the International Monetary Fund, and even the governments of Japan and the United States have all, in one way or another, signaled that outright seizure of Russian sovereign assets runs afoul of the basic legal order that underpins global finance. Yet EU officials, driven by a mix of ideological fanaticism and sheer panic, continue to grope for workarounds. One leader in Europe, Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever, has had the courage to call this what it is. He has compared the asset seizure plan to walking into an embassy and stealing the furniture. He understands that sovereign assets are not a political toy. They are protected by international law for a reason. His stance reportedly enjoys overwhelming public support in Belgium. But because his position obstructs the Brussels machine, everyone knows what comes next. Pressure will intensify. The third degree will be applied. There will be political maneuvers inside Belgium to weaken him, to replace him with a more compliant figure. Media hit pieces will proliferate. The EU does not forgive leaders who stand in the way of its crusade against Russia, even when those leaders are defending the very rule of law Brussels claims to uphold. And all of this, the financial vandalism, the legal nihilism, the attacks on their own systemic credibility, is being done for one reason. The West refuses to accept that the war in Ukraine has been lost on the battlefield. Look at the political theater surrounding President Zelensky. In the United States, Donald Trump has grown increasingly blunt. He refuses to meet Zelensky. He has demanded elections in Ukraine. He states openly that Ukraine is losing the war, that its army is being broken. He is edging closer to questioning Zelensky's very legitimacy. Zelensky, for his part, plays for time. He says he is prepared to hold elections, but only if the United States creates the conditions for them. That is diplomatic code. Translated into plain language, it means defeat the Russians for me, freeze the front line on my terms, then we can talk about elections. When that fantasy collides with reality, Zelensky's own electoral commission steps in and declares that elections are impossible, even under ideal circumstances, for at least 6 months. The message to Washington is obvious. He is not going anywhere, and he will not voluntarily cede power or control over Ukrainian foreign policy. Then we have the Italian episode. Zelensky arrives in Rome, greeted by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni with warm embraces and photo-friendly affection. It looks like solidarity. But behind closed doors, reports suggest a tense and difficult meeting. Corriere della Sera, Italy's closest approximation to a paper of record, says Meloni tried to convey a simple message from the Americans. Washington wants peace. Washington wants territorial concessions from Ukraine. Washington wants this war wound down. Zelensky said no. He then asked her to help soften Trump's position, a leader whose army is being ground down and whose state survives on external life support is still trying to dictate terms to the very powers propping him up. Meanwhile, Meloni's longtime rival and coalition partner, Matteo Salvini, has taken direct aim at the war. He has said that the conflict is lost and that he refuses to divert money from Italy's health system to fund a war that cannot be won. This is not fringe talk. Italy is a country where, despite doses of Russophobia among certain elites, the public sentiment toward Russia remains relatively balanced and often sympathetic. The images of Meloni embracing Zelensky may play well in Brussels and Washington today, but in Italian domestic politics, they may prove toxic ammunition for Salvini tomorrow. Into this chaos steps London's Daily Telegraph, floating what it claims is the American plan for Ukraine, a Korean-style armistice. Under this scheme, Russia retains Donbass and the other territories it currently controls. A heavily monitored demilitarized zone is established. Peacekeepers, whose nationality is conveniently left vague, oversee the ceasefire line. And in one of the more surreal elements, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would be shared with the United States running it. Anyone who understands Russia knows this is dead on arrival. Moscow has made it clear that Zaporizhia NPP is now fully integrated into Russia's nuclear power system, managed by Rosatom, and is not up for negotiation. That is not posturing. It is a statement of a settled fact. More broadly, Russia's core conditions have been consistent since February 2022. Ukrainian membership in NATO is off the table. Any scheme that smuggles in NATO equivalent security guarantees via the back door is unacceptable. The status and rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine must be addressed. The canonical Orthodox Church must be restored and protected. The root causes of the conflict, the 8 years of war against Donbass, the coup of 2014, the militarization of Ukraine as an anti-Russian proxy, must be acknowledged in any real settlement. The Korean scenario being floated ignores these fundamentals. It imagines a cosmetic freeze that would allow the West to pretend that Russia has been held in check without addressing the underlying architecture that led to the war. Russia has already said it will not accept that. Complicating matters even further is a report from Defense One about a real U.S. national security strategy, a document supposedly kept secret, which allegedly sketches a world beyond NATO and beyond the G7, governed instead by a board of 5, the United States, China, Russia, India, and Japan. In this vision, Washington would hold permanent chairmanship, convene meetings, control the agenda, and manage global affairs in consultation with the other 4. Even if such a plan exists, it is detached from reality. China and Russia are strategic partners. Japan is an American client state. That leaves India as the pivotal swing player with enormous leverage. Does Beijing accept a structure in which Washington remains the de facto global arbiter, while also granting Japan, a country with which China has serious territorial and historical disputes, a permanent seat at the table? Does Russia accept Washington as global chair after years of NATO expansion, sanctions, and proxy war on its border? More importantly, none of this is possible without stabilization in U.S.-Russian relations, something that Washington itself claims is now its central strategic goal as it pivots toward long-term competition with China. And stabilization with Russia is impossible if the United States simultaneously demands that Moscow swallow a dictated settlement in Ukraine that contradicts its vital security interests and national red lines. The logic is straightforward. If you genuinely want stable relations with Russia, you cannot try to strip it of its sovereign assets through legally dubious seizures, float peace plans that ignore its stated conditions, say one thing privately in Moscow and something entirely different in Kyiv and European capitals, and continue to arm and bankroll a regime that declares itself committed to reclaiming Crimea and striking deep into core Russian territory. Yet this is exactly what the U.S. and its allies are doing. It is the behavior of a bloc that has not accepted reality. The contrast with the Cold War is instructive. In the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, the United States and the Soviet Union fought proxy wars, most notably in Vietnam, while simultaneously negotiating arms control, building lines of communication, and even conducting joint space missions like Apollo-Soyuz. They understood that their relationship could not be held hostage to every local conflict. Today, by contrast, Washington has effectively allowed Kyiv to veto any improvement in relations with Moscow, insisting that Ukraine be settled on Western terms before normalization can begin. That is a self-inflicted strategic wound. Russia will not accept it, and the battlefield is making that clearer every day. Consider the situation on the ground. Ukrainian officials, including General Syrskyi, continue to make claims that are frankly fantastical. He speaks of Ukrainian control of northern Pokrovsk and advances in multiple sectors. Yet drone footage released by Ukrainians themselves shows Russian armored columns moving through northern Pokrovsk. The mapping projects have quietly adjusted their graphics to reflect what many of us have been saying for weeks. The Ukrainian grouping in Mirnograd is reduced to a small pocket in the northwest of the town, with most of Mirnograd itself already under Russian control. These Ukrainian forces are encircled, pounded by artillery and air power, cut off from reliable supply, and trapped in miserable weather conditions. Their position can only be described as desperate. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, there are persistent reports that Russia has taken Shakov and much of Sofiivka, extending the August breakthrough. This not only threatens further advances towards key nodes like Drushkivka, it has implications for the entire Ukrainian defensive network in the Donbass. A bigger thrust could restore Russian control over places like Zolota Niva and Kostiantynivka's approaches and open the way for a broader operational encirclement. In the Zaporizhia direction, the picture is even more alarming for Kiev. Ukrainian propaganda loudly announced a counterattack which supposedly retook settlements such as Dorozhnyanka or other small villages. In reality, there is little evidence that these were ever in firm Ukrainian hands once Russian offensives began to bite. What does appear to be confirmed, again by Ukrainian drone footage, is that Russian forces have crossed the river near Huliaipol, taking positions on the western bank. That crossing is not a tactical curiosity, it is an operational hinge. Analysts have long pointed out that if Russia could secure a durable bridgehead west of that river, the entire Ukrainian position in Huliaipol would become untenable, and the town would likely fall. Huliaipol is not a large city, but its strategic significance is substantial. It anchors Ukraine's last coherent defensive line east of Orikhiv. If Huliaipol falls and Russia consolidates, the road to Orikhiv opens. Russia already controls settlements like Mala Tokmachka and Novodanilivka. A persistent push from the east would make the continued defense of Orikhiv extremely difficult. Once Orikhiv goes, the Ukrainian front in much of Zaporizhia will evaporate. At that point, the only major Ukrainian stronghold left in the region will be the city of Zaporizhia itself. But even that position is increasingly precarious. There are widespread reports, though not yet officially confirmed by Moscow, that Russian forces have secured Stepanohursk, a settlement less than 20 kilometers south of Zaporizhia. From such positions, Russia can saturate the entire area with drones and precision weapons, hitting logistics hubs, depots, and movement along the Dnipro bridges. We have already seen a dress rehearsal of sorts in the earlier Russian drone strike on a bridge in Dnipro city, which forced a temporary closure for repairs. If Russia decides, at some future point, to systematically degrade or close the bridges around Zaporizhia and Dnipro without destroying them outright, they now possess the tools and the forward staging points to do so. Some Western analysts speak in terms of 6-month or 1-year horizons before Russian forces reach Zaporizhia city. Looking at the tempo of Russian operations and the accelerating deterioration of Ukrainian defenses, I would not be surprised if major advances occur much sooner, perhaps even before winter ends, depending on how long Kyiv can hold Huliaipol and Orikhiv. To the north, around Seversk, the story is similarly grim for Ukraine. The Bakhmutka River runs through the town. Approximately 80% of Seversk lies on the eastern bank, 20% on the western. Russian forces have now crossed the river inside the city. Russian sources, including the often accurate Andrei Marachko, report that Moscow controls about 75% of Seversk, including the town center, securely. The remaining 25% west of the river is under Russian fire control and being methodically cleared. The Ukrainian garrison's only realistic escape route is across open fields to the southwest, towards the village of Ryo-Alexandrivka. Yet, reports indicate that Russian units are now attacking towards that village from the east, not necessarily to storm it immediately, but to cut off or intercept any Ukrainian units attempting to retreat across that corridor. If that is correct, it is only a matter of time, perhaps hours, perhaps days, before we see formal announcements of Seversk's full capture, and Seversk will not fall in isolation. The same broader pattern, cauldrons forming, pockets shrinking, communications collapsing, is visible in multiple sectors, near Mirnograd, near Huliaipol, near Stepanohirsk, in smaller encirclements east of the Oskil River, where Russian forces are reportedly close to finishing off trapped Ukrainian groupings. On top of all that, Russia continues its strategic campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Each major missile and drone strike further weakens the grid. Blackouts are spreading. Protests have already erupted in Kyiv over the lack of electricity. One senior Ukrainian energy official has openly admitted that the system has exhausted its capabilities for repair, that critical spare parts are running out, and that 2 or 3 more large-scale strikes could push the grid into outright collapse. Zelensky's response has been to call for an energy truce. Russia's response has been to ignore him. Kyiv, in parallel, persists with futile and symbolic attacks on Russian territory and shipping, for example, using naval drones to harass tankers headed to Novorossiysk, despite repeated warnings from Moscow and protests from Turkey, whose own economic zone is being endangered by these actions. These pinprick Ukrainian attacks achieve little militarily, but carry a real risk of escalation at sea. At minimum, we can expect Russia to increase naval protection for its tankers, possibly in coordination with Turkey, which has no desire to see Ukrainian drones turn the Black Sea into a chaotic shooting gallery. Yet Kyiv continues, apparently believing that provoking Russia will somehow force NATO deeper into the conflict. All of this, the collapsing front lines, the dying energy grid, the last-ditch financial schemes, points to one conclusion: the Western project in Ukraine is entering its terminal phase, and the political elites who built it have no exit strategy that acknowledges reality. Russia, by contrast, has been remarkably consistent. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has repeatedly emphasized that any settlement must address the root causes of the conflict and fulfill the original objectives of the special military operation announced in February 2022. These include demilitarizing Ukraine as an anti-Russian spear, securing the rights and safety of Russian speakers, and ensuring that NATO's eastward march stops at Russia's door. Moscow is not interested in temporary freezes that allow the West to rearm Ukraine and try again in 5 or 10 years. It is seeking a lasting structural change in Europe's security order. That is why proposals like the Korean scenario or any arrangement that tries to smuggle in NATO-like guarantees under another label are non-starters. Instead of facing this, Washington and its European satellites are doubling down on measures that will haunt them for decades. Massive asset seizures that undermine confidence in Western financial systems, political witch hunts against leaders who dissent, and a refusal to tell their own populations the truth about the war. If the West proceeds with these asset confiscation schemes and an ensuing financial crisis erupts, it will not be Russia that has destroyed the Western-led world order. It will be the West itself. No serious power, not China, not India, not the Gulf states, not Latin American countries, is going to entrust its reserves and sovereign wealth to jurisdictions that treat legal immunity as a temporary inconvenience to be overridden when geopolitics demands. The irony is that in their obsession with punishing Russia, Western elites are dismantling the very instruments that underpin their global dominance: the rule of law, the sanctity of contracts, and the neutrality of financial infrastructure. On the battlefield, Russia is grinding down Ukrainian forces, taking territory and shaping conditions for even larger strategic gains. In the diplomatic arena, Moscow is patient, making clear that it is open to negotiation, but only on terms that reflect the changed balance of power and the hard realities created by Western overreach. The United States and Europe had a chance early on to accept Russia's security concerns, to implement the Minsk agreements honestly, and to keep Ukraine out of the role of battering ram. They chose instead to turn Ukraine into an anti-Russian project. They chose escalation. They chose to ignore every Russian red line. Now they are discovering that Russia meant what it said. The West can keep spinning fantasies about Korean armistices, secret boards of 5, or magic financial tricks to conjure money for Kyiv out of Russia's frozen reserves. It can silence dissenting voices at home and pretend that there is still political consensus behind this war. But none of that changes the facts on the ground. Ukraine is losing the war. Its economy is shattered. Its energy grid is failing. Its demography is bleeding out. Its political leadership is clinging to power while refusing meaningful compromise. And the Western elites who claim to be defending democracy, law, and stability are the ones tearing up their own legal order in a last-ditch attempt to delay defeat. In the long run, when historians look back at this episode, They will not only ask why the West lost in Ukraine, they will ask why its leaders chose to destroy their own financial and political credibility on the way down, and why so many of those who knew better remained silent.